In this video, I use a tire inflator. I use a metal brush on my arms. And I race Old Man Winter. Welcome back to my 1996 GMC Sonoma Minitruck build. And in the last episode, we took the frame off the frame table and connected the rear suspension to the frame. If you missed that episode and you want to get caught up, check out the link above. I did mention in my last episode that we'll be working on the front suspension, which we will, but there's also one more thing that I need to do in the driveway before I kind of close things up for the winter. And with the snow starting to come, I'm running out of time. Now it looks like I will have a window next week where it's going to be slightly warmer, so any snow that has fallen should be melted by then. And that's what we're going to work on first. And the thing that I want to do is get the cab back on the frame, hopefully permanently. Now there's a couple of things I have to do first. One being, when I built the drive shaft tunnel, I had the cab on its back and I had extended it further, knowing that when I put the cab back on its bottom, that I need to grind it down and weld up. So I still need to do that. Also, the drive shaft tunnel tied in with the mounts for the seats as well as the seat belts. And that whole plate I had to take off so that I could do some modifications. And in doing so, I tried to drill out some spot welds. And as you can see over here and over here, I started to drill things out, but it didn't actually work the way I wanted it to. But now I got to clean that up, weld those up as well.
First step is to take the flap wheel and roughly grind it all back. Then using a 60 grit Roloc disc, I fine tune it. For the spot welds, I use a wire brush to clean them out. While I was at it, I also cleaned up any other spot welds that had rust starting to show.
So I decided to clean the back of the cab. It's not perfect, but way better than it was, and allows me to see a lot more of what's happening back here. One, you can see some kind of black and gray. I think it's road grime because you see a bunch over here as well. A little bit over here, so it's not from me doing any painting or any other work on the truck, so it must have been there before. Then you can see here where the paint's been burnt. On the other side is where the jack holder was, and I grinded that smooth, and I must have just put way too much heat into it, and that caused the paint to burn. And it's also dented over here. Again, that's where the jack holder was, so I'll probably need to do a hammer and dolly just to get that down. For me, it doesn't have to be perfect because this area is hidden by the bed, so I'm not too worried about it. My main focus really is getting rust, so I started to address some of it. I have to do a little bit more, but I'm going to grind down as much as I can. Other areas, what I'll spend time is with the rust converter. And then lastly, I will have to do some welding and make sure that that is smooth and that there's no holes.
Time for some sheet metal welding. For me, this type of work is annoying and satisfying at the same time. Plus it forces me to be patient. I slowly weld up the perimeter of the tunnel, making sure things cool down before starting the next round of welds. The results are not pretty, but after some grinding and sanding, they are looking better. I find a hole that's only visible from inside the cab, so I weld that up. Here's what it looked like from the outside. After another round of welding and grinding, here's what it looks like. Next up, I use a gel phosphoric acid-based rust converter and just brush it on. The instructions say to wait until it dries, so I give it a day. While I wait for the rust converter to dry, I address the dent at the back using a hammer and dolly. You can hear the ping noise when the panel is getting flatter. I'm not a professional, and what I'm able to accomplish is good enough. Since I still have time left in the day, I now focus on the A-arms. These are Thorbros S10 control arms, which I purchased maybe 13 to 15 years ago, and they don't sell them anymore according to their website. I have used these for my mock-ups, but now they have surface rust and need some paint. This is my first time ever taking these things apart, so I start by taking off the bolt and the large washer off. There's a keyed washer inside, and I use a mallet to help pop it off. Then it's the bushing, and I try using a flathead screwdriver, and I slowly make progress. After I can get a good grip on it, I pull it off. Then I start on the other side. To get the second bushing off, I push the whole arm off the shaft. Then I can slide the shaft through the rest of the arm. Lastly is the upper ball joint, which is held in with 4 bolts. Time to remove the rust with a wire brush. Then for the part of the shaft that goes into the bushing, I lightly use some Scotch-Brite. I had already removed the bushings from the lower arms and the ball joints need to be pressed out, so I just leave them in and continue to use a wire brush on them.
Well, it looks like Old Man Winter's here, but he's going away on vacation next week, so I'm racing to get everything done before he comes back, which means I need to finish the front suspension and prime up all the metal that's on the cab. For the front suspension, the next thing I need to do is some welding. This is the shock bracket that I made, and the reason I'm not using the one that you can option with these lower control arms is because I recessed the shocks into the frame. Now, I had these tack welded on both of the lower control arms, but I need to now finish weld them, and you can see there's quite a bit of gap, especially on the passenger side. So it's going to take me a little while to take it up because I have to build up the metal, and I don't want to put too much heat because I don't want it to move too much. So I'm going to slowly work on that. While I'm doing that, I'll move over to the upper control arms and get them cleaned and degreased.
I start off with a few more tacks just to make sure the tabs are in place before adding any heat. It also helps me get focus with TIG welding. I lay beads that are about half the length of the tab at a time. For the large gap, I build up some weld on the tab to help close it up a bit. It isn't pretty, but this will help a lot. And here's what the end results look like. There's always room for improvement. Now back to the cab. After a day, I rinse off the rust converter, then clean it with some surface prep. Lastly, I paint the bare metal with some self-etching primer. And while doing that, I remember something else.
So while I was painting, I remembered one key component that's required for the front suspension, and that is the spindles or uprights. And as you can see here, there's a little bit of surface rust on them. So similar to the rest of the front suspension, I need to clean it, degrease it, prep it, and paint it, which means I need to disassemble the brakes. Now, one thing that I messed up on way back when I assembled these is I didn't put enough grease in the bearings. So I'd have to do that anyway. And I did buy new seals so I could pop those off, throw them out, properly grease the bearings, and then reassemble it with the new seals. So my next step is tear these apart.
First, I have to get the caliper bolts off, and I use my light impact gun, which doesn't do anything. I then bring in the air impact and they come off easily. Next, I try to pull the calipers and they're hanging onto something. I do remember that one of the pads were slightly thicker than the rest, and I had to hammer it on, so this could be what's holding it back. But it didn't make sense that the caliper wasn't moving because of the pad. Now at this point, I'm sure some of you are screaming at the video telling me what is holding me back. I'm guessing it has something to do with the pad, so I use a pry bar and mallet to help free it. And after I get it off, you can see that there's a spring on the back of the pad that I forgot about. With that out of the way, I pry up the dust cap, remove the castle nut, and then slide the rotor off. I remove the surface rust with a couple of wire brushes. And since I have these tools out, I use them to clean the body mounts.
It was a lot of work, but I finally got the spindles and the body mounts clean, dried, and ready for the next step, which is the rust conversion. For the spindles and the A-arms, I'm going to use the same process, which is metal prep, spray it on, leave it for 20 minutes, rinse it off, it'll be good to go. But for the body mounts, because they're really rusted, I'm going to try something different because I know I'm going to have to leave them in overnight with whatever solution that I use. And with metal prep, just that little can is not enough to cover everything all at once. And it is quite expensive. It's $30 a bottle Canadian. And I'd have to get a couple of bottles, be able to cover everything so I could do it overnight. So I'm going to dunk everything into this bucket of Evapo-Rust. Now I've had this for over 15 years. I haven't really used it, and I'm hoping it's still effective. So it's going to be a bit of an experiment, but I think it's going to be okay. So let's get the rust off of all these parts. Now, other than the body mounts that are going to be sitting in the Evapo-Rust for overnight, for the rest of the parts, I'm going to do a bit of a production line where I'm going to get metal prep on a couple of them, paint them, and while they're drying, get the next couple of parts with metal prep, and so on and so forth. So which brings me to the paint selection. And I'm going to do one more experiment, which is using this chassis and roll bar paint. It is a one-step paint. It does not need any primer, but it does say to scuff the parts with 320 or a scuff pad. So before I put any metal prep on the A-arms, I think I'm going to scuff them first so it gets that rough surface. Then I'll clean them, put on the metal prep, clean them again, and then they'll be ready for paint.
It is the next day and the paint is dried on the arms. Did you catch the spot that I missed? I need to wait 7 days before I can touch it up. So let's have a look at the body mounts. The solution does look darker, and after fishing a mount off, I don't have high hopes. Here's what it looks like dried off, and it seems like it is working, but it still needs some time.
So here's where I'm at. It's Sunday night and it looks like my window to be able to get the cab on the frame is ever shrinking. Now I'm targeting Tuesday morning. So this is what I need to get done. First off, the spindles need to dry. I just sprayed them this morning. It just needs a few more hours, then we'll be good there. I have to say, I'm not really happy with them. It's not the paint, it's more about me, and I had to cut some corners and I'm not that happy about it. First, I noticed before I painted them, there is a little bit of grease on some of the spots. I didn't take that off. Also, cast iron, it was fairly rusty, and I think I could have used a little bit more time with metal prep. But again, I need to have these ready so I could put them on the truck, so I can roll out the truck, so I could put on the cab and roll it back in. And then I'll be able to do a lot of projects during the winter time in the garage. Otherwise, my project may stall out if I don't have the cab on the frame. So while I'm not entirely happy about it, I think what I've done will at least last for a couple of years, and then future me can deal with it at a later date. Second thing is the cab mounts, which are in the bucket, and it's looking different. Actually, I could almost see into it now. So as you saw before, it looked okay, but there was still some rust, so I gave it more time. So we'll pull this out, but I'm not 100% confident. And what I'm going to do afterwards is clean it, degrease it, put on a little bit of metal prep, just maybe for 20 minutes. And then instead of spray painting it, I think I'm going to brush on POR 15, because unlike the spindles and the rest of the suspension, it's going to be a little bit harder to take the body mounts off and redo them at a later date. So I want to be able to protect them as best as I can, given the time and the materials that I have on hand. Third item is the front suspension. I have to put this all together. So it's painted, as I mentioned before. There's a couple of spots I'm going to have to touch up in 7 days. That won't be a problem. So I need to assemble all these, get the grease fittings in, and fill them up with grease. And the last thing is the brakes. Well, more around the discs and the bearings. So I have to repack them with grease, reinstall them, put in the seals, and then I can attach them onto the spindle once they are dry. So with the spindles drying, the next thing that I can do is tackle the body mounts.
So I fish out the body mounts from the Evapo-Rust, clean them with a degreaser and a toothbrush 3 times, spray on some metal prep, and wait 20 minutes. I didn't seal my can of POR 15 properly and a crust occurred, but luckily all the paint underneath was fine. I just had to peel it away. I paint one side of the mounts with a couple of coats and let it dry overnight. And then the next day, I paint the other side.
Now with the body mounts painted and drying, I can turn my attention to assembling the front suspension. And before I get into that, I want to show you how the grease fittings work on the upper A-arms. You can see here this threaded area, that is where the grease fitting goes. And when you put in grease, it's going to push it into the core of the cylinder and it will come out this little hole over here. Now this core also has a thread where it assembles everything together. So that bolt stops the grease from coming out of the sides. And originally when I took apart the A-arms, I noticed there was some pipe sealant on the end of the thread, which I'm guessing is to stop the grease from coming out of the sides. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to use a blue Loctite instead, which means I'll still use grease to assemble everything, but I need to make sure that the blue Loctite is cured before I push any of the grease through the core of the upper A-arms.
I temporarily plug the ends of the A-arm shafts and add some grease. Then I grease up the bushings. I slide the A-arm over the shaft and start to insert one of the bushings. Then goes the second bushing. Next is the slotted washer. Then the bolt and washer without thread locker. Once that's tight, I use a mallet to get the first bushing all the way on. Then the washer and bolt to get everything properly seated. Now it's time for the ball joint, which goes on easily with 4 bolts. Time for the grease fittings. With the upper arms assembled, I back off the bolts and add some thread locker. This stuff reacts to metal, so you need to make sure that the tip of the bottle doesn't touch the bolt. The lower A-arms are very much like the rear suspension, which I assembled in the previous episode. Grease the bushings, grease the sleeve, pop in the bushings, insert the sleeve, and squeeze them in the vise. Or hammer it in with the mallet, since my arms were getting tired holding these A-arms.
I short a couple of grease fittings, so I grabbed those along with the new tube of grease. I'm going to grease everything up once it's on the truck. So next step, let's get these on the truck.
I start with the lower A-arms and get them loosely bolted in. I had to pull down the front air springs out of storage, and you can see that the upper cups are rusted. I totally forgot about those when I was getting the rest of the front suspension cleaned and painted. So I've conceded that I'm going to have to take apart the front suspension again to do more cleaning and painting. I needed the A-arm to be a bit lower, so I raised up the frame slightly with the jack. With the bag in, I move on to the upper A-arms. I added some homemade shims to increase the negative camber, and I'll get some proper ones later. Then on goes the A-arm. Now for the spindle. I get them on the ball joints and spin on the castle nuts.
I finished installing the passenger side, then I tightened everything up. I didn't go up to the torque values because I know I'm going to have to take everything apart again, but everything's snug, so I know it's not going to fall off as I pull this in and out of the driveway. Now, one thing I need to note is that I am going to need hardware for most of it. Some of it's just fairly corroded, and it's just better off that before I actually truly get on the road that I replace all of the hardware. And the castle nut on the lower ball joint on the passenger side seems to be sitting a little low so that the cotter pin might not engage with the castle nut itself. The other ones seem fine, upper ball joints, driver's side ball joint, that all seems fine. So I think I just need to get a washer. Maybe I'll buy another one just in case when I torque everything down that the driver's side also needs it. So a couple of washers, that'll push up the castle nut just enough that it can engage into the hole so that the cotter pin can catch that castle nut. Anyway, next step is to get the discs on, because once I have the discs, then I'll be able to get the tires. But before I can actually get the discs on, I need to repack the bearings and put in that seal.
I add a lot of grease in between the inner and outer bearing surface, then pack in a lot of the grease into the inner bearings and drop them in. Next are the rear seals, and I use a chunk of aluminum and a mallet to get them seated into place. I flip the rotors over and then pack grease into the outer bearings, and drop those along with the keyed washer. I grease up the spindle and slide on the rotor. I add the castle nut and tighten it while I spin the rotor to make sure all the bearings are seated. Now it's time for the tires. I place a jack under the lower A-arm and raise it slightly. Installing the tires, I tighten up 3 of the lug nuts. I'll use 5 when I actually drive it, so don't worry about that. Then I lower it back down. Now with all 4 tires on, let's raise it up.
So today's the day we get the cab on the frame, and unlike the suspension, my plan is once it gets on the frame, it stays there, and any work I need to do to it is done while it's on the frame. So permanently back on the frame. Fingers crossed. My next step is to assemble the body mounts, so I'm going to do those next. Body mounts are in place. So now I gotta get ready for my friend that's coming over in less than an hour. So I gotta move everything into the garage and maybe do a little bit of reshuffling in here so it's ready for when I need to bring the truck back in.
I move the cab out, get the chassis on dollies on the front, bring the chassis out, and get dollies on the rear. I line up the cab and connect it to the hoist. With everything in place and with some help from my friend and my wife, we get the cab sitting on the frame. And since it's outside, let's drop the suspension and see how low we can go. It's sitting on 2x4s, but it's looking awesome.
All right, the Sonoma is back in the garage. It's aired out, and just look at how low it is. I still have it on a bit of blocks. I don't want to get the frame right on the concrete right away, but wow, this thing is just so low. I've seen body drop trucks in magazines, but never in person. And just to see how low this truck is just wild. I'm so excited. There's still a lot of work to do, but I'm taking a step back just to look at all the work that I put in over the last few months. Man, this is just so great. I'm so happy. I'm ecstatic. I can't just stop staring at this. I think this is another video that's going a bit longer than I wanted to, so I gotta wrap things up. Thank you for all those that have subscribed, and if you haven't, please do so. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, and we'll see you next time.